All right, what's up, everybody? Jason here. I wanted to continue our series on the topic of exile and empire. And in this second part, I want to talk about the topic of avoiding the void. Okay? But before we do that, I want to do a little bit of a recap just to remind you of the way that we were talking about this term of exile in our last series of talks. I suggested that obviously there is a literal definition of exile that you find in the Bible, which refers to like an involuntary captivity in a foreign land, right? So obviously Israel and Judah in the Old Testament were led into captivity, into exile in Babylon. And this punishment was sort of the consummate covenant curse that God threatened against the people of Israel over and over again. He said, if you obey me, you'll be blessed in the lands. But if you disobey, if you're rebellious, if you ignore my laws and my statutes, I'm going to send some foreign army to invade you and to take you into captivity, to take you into exile. So that's sort of the most basic literal definition of the term exile. Then in the New Testament, you also get a kind of more figurative or spiritual definition of exile, according to which the writer specifically of Hebrews, but even more, 1 Peter, talks about that we, under the new covenant, are sort of like exiles in a spiritual sense because we're awaiting our heavenly homeland. Now, it doesn't matter whether I agree with that, kind of usage. The point is that it is made. It is another way that the concept of exile functions in the Bible. Under the Old Covenant, a literal sense of captivity against your will, punishment for national sin. And then under the New Testament, it's more an issue of we are awaiting a heavenly homeland and we are not there yet. So we, in some sense, are pilgrims and exiles. That's why Peter says to conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. And that ties into a kind of eschatological sense of exile that I alluded to in my last talk, where eschatologically there's a sense in which let me put it this way, eschatologically God's people are in one of two conditions, either theocracy or exile. Okay, so if there is a land, if God's people are in a land of their own that God gave them, they are by definition in a theocracy. If they're not in a land that God has given them, they are by definition in exile. So there's a sense in which Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden were in a kind of theocratic context, because it wasn't until they violated the prohibition against eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that God sent them east of Eden, right, where they wandered in exile. The same can be said, of course, of Israel in the land of Canaan. That was the land that God gave them. Which of course is a type, it's typological of the heavenly homeland, according to the New Testament, that awaits God's people, right? Whenever God's people are in a theocracy, the rules governing how they relate to the culture around them are different than they are when God's people are in exile. And we're getting a bit into the weeds here, and I don't want to spend too much time on that, so I'm just going to move on to the fourth and, for me, most important sense of this concept of exile is what I call a suspicion of empire. Okay, so I'm setting exile and empire, I'm juxtaposing them, setting them over against one another as kind of paradigmatic categories. Empire being shorthand for strong theology, and exile being shorthand for weak theology. And you can look at the introduction in 5 parts to this Exile and Empire series on YouTube at the Relic 2024 channel to get a bit more of a sense of what I was talking about with that. And so the definition of exile that I'm working with and that I'm trying to develop here is a sort of postmodern suspicion of empire. And I'm kind of piggybacking on Jean-Francois Lyotard's description of postmodernism, which, again, postmodernism isn't easy to define, but if there is a definition that's agreed upon, this might be it. Lyotard said that postmodernism is incredulity toward meta-narrative, okay? So it's not looking at meta-narratives, and by meta-narrative I mean any big story, right? The Enlightenment liberalism, the age of reason and some sort of unified theory of knowledge, capitalism, socialism, communism, scientism, Christianity. All of these can function as meta-narratives, and what postmodernism does, according to Lyotard, is not supplant one meta-narrative with another, or say this meta-narrative is wrong, I have a better one, but rather it's a suspicion of all of them. It's incredulity, a lack of belief in all of them. And that is how Exile functions for me and how I'm trying to develop it here. It's not an alternate strong theology. And I used some examples of strong theology in my last talk. I talked about issues like canon and dogma and heresy. Okay? So, for example, in order for us, evangelical people, I do not consider myself an evangelical and haven't for a long time. But I'm very familiar with evangelicalism. I in some sense, I grew up in it, and I ministered in it as a pastor, as a missionary in other contexts. There's constant debate about, like, is this idea biblical, or not? Is it unbiblical? I remember, people would discuss issues like Calvinism or the timing of the rapture. Is this idea in Calvinism of total depravity biblical, or is it unbiblical? Is it biblical to say that there's going to be a rapture 7 years before the return of Christ, or is that unbiblical? Well, in order to even have a category called biblical, you have to have a Bible. You have to have a New Testament, right? And in order for there to be a New Testament, there needs to be some person or group of people who decided at some point in history these 27 books constitute the New Testament and no others. So there's no books out there that should be in here, and there's no books in here that should be out there, right? And they needed to do that in such a way to speak to the entire church with some level of authority, right? So when you go to the bookstore and you go to the Christianity section, the religion section, you look at all the Bibles, all of them are going to have 27 books in their New Testament. You look at the table of contents. All of them are going to have the same 27 books, right? And so at some point in the past, and we don't really, I don't think we really appreciate this enough, because we live now, and so everything is done, and the Bible comes as this like bound book, with a table of contents at the beginning and, chapter and verse. But we forget that at some point someone had to make this determination, and they needed to do it with a sufficient authority to bind the entire church so that everyone, east or west, wherever you live in the world, and whenever you lived, agrees that these 27 books are the canon, right? Canon meaning the Greek word, which means a measuring stick, like a ruler or something, that functions as a kind of standard, right? Okay, so the debates we used to have about whether or not such and such a doctrine is biblical presuppose the existence of a Bible, which presupposes the existence of a New Testament, which could not have emerged in the way it did, and which could not function the way it does without some sort of imperial authority, some sort of authority that speaks on behalf of God to the whole church. And that's what empire is. It's strong theology. Now, once you've got a canon, you can start talking about whether stuff is biblical or not. Until there's a Bible, you can't talk about whether something is biblical, because there's no referent, Once there's a Bible, once there's a New Testament, then you can start talking about whether something is biblical. And then you start getting into issues of whether or not something is essential. In Catholic circles, they use the term dogma. In our culture now, dogma or dogmatic just seems to refer kind of generally to somebody who's like really, really sure of himself, or really, really belligerent, or insisting upon his point of view or whatever. But in Catholic religious theological language, dogma refers to those elements of the Christian faith, of Christian theology, that are essential to Christianity. In other words, something that's constitutive, something that is such that without it you don't have Christianity. Whatever you might have, it's not Christianity without this and that and the other thing, right? So things that come to mind that everybody agrees upon, whether Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox, are the Trinity, the idea that God exists as one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the deity of Christ, that Christ, the second person of the Godhead, is the eternal Logos who pre-existed before he was born. He incarnated, assumed a human body and human nature along with his divine nature, And he is God. He is not the Father, he's not the Holy Spirit, but he's God, right? Probably if you're some sort of Christian watching this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. None of this is going to be new. So those are a couple examples. Of course, the atonement and the bodily resurrection, that Jesus rose again on the third day in the body. These are things that qualify for just about every branch of Christianity as dogma, as essential to the faith. But again, echoing what I said about canon, it's meaningless to talk about something being essential to the faith without some massive exercise of imperial power and authority, which is what empire is, right? So similarly to, in our day, the debates over misinformation on the internet, right? We can't have misinformation, that such and so is saying something that's misinformation, so we have to delete it or censor it or demonetize it or deplatform that person or whatever. In the same way, in order for the entire church essentially to agree that these, however many, 5 essentials are in fact essential and not secondary or tertiary to the Christian faith, well, that requires a display of power. It requires an imperial exercise of force, of flex, right? Because who's to say, right? Who gets to say that? Like, who gets to speak for the entire church and say the Trinity is non-negotiable? Most Christians agree that the Trinity is non-negotiable, but they have a hard time explaining who gets to say that. What if someone were to come along and say, I think the Trinity is secondary, and the most important thing is whether you speak in tongues, right? That person, most likely by most theologians, Catholic or Protestant, would be told, you are absolutely wrong. Tongues is secondary, if that. Spiritual gifts themselves are peripheral, but the Trinity and the deity of Christ are absolutely essential. But without a person or a body who's been given the authority to say, thus saith the Lord, and speak and adjudicate these kinds of things, all you've got is a sort of he said, she said proof text battle, right? Which no one could ever win. And so in my last series of talks, I described the way empire functions and the way that it has historically functioned. And this is just a couple ways. There are many, many more. But the ones that are most likely, on the forefront in the minds of evangelical people is on this issue of dogma and canon. And then the flip side of dogma is heresy, right? You hear the term heresy, it means something that strikes at the heart in a negative way of the Christian religion. So someone comes along, like let's say a Mormon knocks at your door and says, Jesus is just a man, he wasn't God. Well, most evangelicals, I've been there, I've answered that door, I've heard that, and I've said this. I've said, well, that's heresy. Denying the deity of Christ is heresy, right? Because when you're denying a dogma and saying it's not true and you're supplanting it with some other theory, well, that's by definition heresy. But again, heresy according to whom, right? Who gets to make that determination that this denial amounts to heresy, this affirmation amounts to dogma? This is essential, this is not. All of these categories only make sense in the context of imperial might, of power plays, of epic proportions, okay? And so what I have defined exile as, the way exile functions, according to this series I'm doing and what I'm trying to develop with you all, is that it is more a posture than it is a position, right? So exile is not just another strong theology. Exile is not just a rejection of one set of imperial assumptions or teachings, replacing them with another set of equally strong but different imperial assertions or arguments or teachings. But instead, exile is a posture of suspicion. In the same way that postmodernism is a posture of incredulity toward meta-narrative, exile is a posture of suspicion. It's a giving of side-eye, a slow blinking, sort of looking askance at these imperial claims, regardless of what they are, right? Exile functions as a posture that is inherently suspicious of acts of imperial power and authority. Okay? And so in this series on exile and empire, what I'm trying to do is flesh that out, and we kind of talked about much of this in our last series of talks.